Welcome to the IpX True North Podcast, where we connect people, processes, and tools.
Well, everyone, thanks for joining us on this podcast. I have a very special guest with me today, someone I've known now for probably over a decade, Dr. Nathan Hartman from Purdue University will be joining me today to talk about the ecosystem of tomorrow. We're actually going to do a multi-part series, and today's podcast will focus on organizational change management. So with that, I just want to say, Nate, if I can, or Dr. Hartman, you can tell me what you want me to address you today. But thanks for joining me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joe. Nate's good, just not late to dinner. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think this is going to be a good podcast series.
Well, with that, Nate, for me, what I really want to talk about, and, you and I have probably pontificated on this enough over the last 10 years to probably be tired of talking about it. But the reality is, it's my perspective that organizations, academia, and individuals alone are really behind the curve when it comes to upskilling, when it comes to education, when it comes to workforce development. And we've been slapped in the face with it over the last couple of years with the pandemic, virtual workforce. And I think now more than ever, we really need to get these things. And it's a bit of a war cry. It's a mantra of mine. We really need value-added change. So with that, what's your perspective on everything that's going on? And I know we've talked about it in the past, but here we are. It's 2022. We have organizations still having high rates of attrition. We have the skilled trades workforce struggling to find workers. We have what I believe is a disconnect between higher ed and the industry. If we can, what's your perspective on all of this?
Sure. There's a lot to unpack there. So let me maybe offer a few different types of opinions. I think one is at times I do think there is a disconnect between academia and industry. I guess I'm just going to use those terms really broadly. That being said, though, I also think at times there is even a disconnect within industry, both in certain verticals as well as across those verticals, about what they really want with their workforce. That's one thing. I also think another thing we have to look at is what is the difference between sort of educating or training someone who has been with the company or maybe has at least been in the workforce for some period of time, so they have experience to come back to, versus someone who would be filling a very junior role or say first time hire kind of a role. I think everything from the expectations to around their productivity to their contribution to the company culture is probably different compared to somebody who's been there with say 5 or 10 years of experience. And another thing that we're all dealing with now, as we are hopefully coming out the backside of this pandemic, that I think the expectations around work have changed. I'll say in my organization right now, we're trying to hire 2 staff positions, and it's hard to generate applications to those positions. And one of the things we've all talked about, but yet not really sure exactly how to fix, is the fact that there are a lot of unfilled positions in the workforce today, and yet it seems like there aren't people to fill them. However, when you go to certain parts of the country or maybe even around the state, unemployment varies. It's not the same from county to county or state to state. And even though it's relatively low compared to other times in history, there are certain spots that are higher than others. And so one of the things that immediately kind of jumps into my head is, well, where'd all the people go? It's unfortunately, we don't have a real good way to sometimes to monitor attrition. Some people, there's always attrition, right? But some people may have just stopped looking, or some people may have taken up a completely different kind of a job in this sort of gig oriented economy that they may not have done otherwise.
Yeah,
So I
and you
think
touched.
there's a lot there, Joe. I think that to unpack, some of which, industry and academia can work together on. I think, but some of it is, it might be one of those things where it just so happens that we're the ones here right now during this social phenomenon, and there's larger societal forces at work that we can try to influence, maybe nudge in one direction or another, but not sure if we'll be able to get our arms around this completely anytime soon. I think this is going to be sort of a multi-year, evolution, if you will, not necessarily revolution.
Yeah, I agree. And, unfortunately, I think I'm going to add more weight to this discussion. But you mentioned something we also need to talk about at the state level, right? And even honestly, the federal level. But, we've discussed the quote unquote brain drain that states are facing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not only are we losing the workforce, but we're actually losing our voters, right? They're moving rapidly. So I think there's a lot, and thankfully we've got a lot of time, and I think we'll probably break this into two parts. But for me, it's there is a lot there, and I agree. And then one thing I'd like to do is maybe, start unpacking a little bit of that. And if it's okay with you, I'd kind of, from my perspective, like to start with the industry side and maybe break that down by leader, by your your director level, and then your workforce level, and what perspectives, from your seat, do you feel these individuals, these entities should start adapting toward, and for me, from a leadership perspective, for example, I've been around a long time, and I've seen a lot of organizational changes. I've seen a lot of good, seen a lot of bad as well, and typically it gets spearheaded by a IT revolution, right? A new software. It seems like every 6 years, we get this new software that's going to solve world hunger across all industry. And I say that with a mischievous grin on my face. But many of us have those scars, and with those new softwares or those new tools, typically our leaders try to enforce some level of what they consider OCM. In my perspective, that's always the wrong way of doing it. I as much as I am keeping things intertwined or connected, I believe, OCM and your IT improvement projects at a corporate level need to be handled a little separately. Now, when you start getting into business engagement, you start getting into the roles and the process changes. Yes, those are elements of OCM, but we're talking about bigger picture today. So from a leadership perspective, it's been my opinion, there's a lot of token statements on OCM. There's a lot of token initiatives. You take a 2-day training, you get a little certificate, and you go away and you forget everything you learned. From my perspective, it's got to be top down, and there's got to be a huge investment from a leadership perspective. Not only do they need to get the training needed and be a part of those discussions, but they need to lead it from top down. From your seat in the house, from your perspective, kind of what's your view, on leadership and OCM?
Well, I think from my perspective, I guess I would not disagree necessarily with what you said. I may look at it a little bit differently in that I think there's a couple different pieces to OCM that someone's got to wrestle with. There's the mechanics of it, meaning how do I want my organization structured? Who reports to who? Which group creates information? Which group uses that information? We talk about our processes and our workflows and that sort of stuff. So there's that part of organizational change management, but there's also the cultural element of change management, which is how do my people work together? Do we have esprit de corps in such a way that when we face a tough challenge, will people rally behind that and tackle it? Do we have an organization where people can freely come to each other with concerns, with challenges, with confrontations, with things where people don't always agree, but yet you've got to work towards some kind of a solution. And then there's, I think, the knowledge part of change management, which is how do we keep our bread and butter, our secrets? How do we keep our IP intellectually and from our products and so on in our organization? And education, arguably, in workforce development, it can arguably help with all three of those, but it's I think maybe slightly more important in kind of the cultural aspect and in the knowledge aspect, in the sense that, I mean, there are a lot of models that somebody could follow on how to structure the mechanics of their organization, right? And a lot of people talk about, flat structures and hierarchical structures and so on, but organizations develop structures because they had to, right? There was just too much information and too many decisions for one person to make them all. And so we had to start subdividing things. Obviously, products became more complicated. Organizations became more complicated. When supply chains became a thing, those became more complicated, right? So you needed an organizational structure that would allow information to flow, decisions to be made, and for the organization to function. Over time, obviously, there's a certain viscosity, if you will, to how that information flows. And in some organizations, the information flow is more viscous than others, and that causes certain problems. And so, my discussion on this is probably not going to focus really in the structural piece. It's going to be more about the culture piece, more about the education piece. And I think for leaders, it's important, obviously, that they have a good understanding of their corporate culture. It's important that they educate their employees on what that culture is, why it is what it is, what that means to their customers, why it's important, how it can help them do the mechanics and structural stuff of change management when it comes time. You and I both know that culture, either helps you or it greatly hinders you in doing all sorts of things in your organization, right? And without being able to harness that to work for you rather than against you, if you're not able to do that, then you're likely going to not be as successful as you could be when it comes to organizational change management. Obviously, when you look at what IpX does, and I'd even say others in the market as well, ultimately you're trying to help folks get their arms around the mechanics of all three of those pieces, right? The structural, the cultural, the educational pieces of organizational change management. But a leader's got to have their finger to some degree on the pulse of all three of those. Obviously, they're not down in the weeds day to day most of the time, but but they really need to have an understanding, and somebody who can, in fact, tell truth to power when it's necessary to say, look, we're not going in the right direction here.
Yeah, and I think that ties in really well, and you mentioned the phrase knowledge management. You and I have discussed this as well. When you talk about those kind of three or four elements from a leadership perspective, I think that's where a lot of companies and leaders are struggling. Is you have your standard attrition. We've seen an uptick in that, but you also have a lot of companies that are successful and they promote career progression, mm-hmm. right? And that's an equal problem, and sometimes a greater issue, especially with large companies that are cash rich. They're continually pushing their workforce to progress, to upskill, and you have that knowledge management transfer issue. And that is one thing, much like IpX and others. There's some great entities out there that really focus on some of these key elements. But it's one reason we launched the Idea Academy, and coupled that with the CM2 model for knowledge management, because that's where a lot of companies just have that rework, and they're recreating that knowledge year after year after year, and some months after months. And it's typically that handover, right? And it's that upskill of, I just got out of university, or I just changed jobs, or I changed locations, or I changed industry. Regardless, I'm coming into this new entity, and my hesitation or my reluctance and my fear of not being successful is I need that knowledge to be successful. And if it's all the quote unquote tribal knowledge, that makes things very difficult. And I do think that's one area from a leadership perspective, they're trying to figure out how to tackle. And at the end of the day, it's an investment. It has to be an investment. It has to be led top down, and it can't just be passed down from position to position or changeover to changeover. And I think we've seen a lot of static ways of developing education or training. We've seen a lot of static ways of managing knowledge, managing that IP. I think it needs to be more dynamic. And what I mean by that, it's got to be more intuitive. It's got to be more self-paced. It's got to be more usable and functional. We've all taken the PowerPoint by death trainings. You spend 6 months in a very small conference room or a closet going through all your onboarding classes or your new position courses, and you just lose it. You don't pay attention. It's not functional. So those are.
To that point, I think your training also has to be adaptable. And I mean, not just your mechanism for doing it, but your content that you have. To me, there's nothing more sort of poignant and powerful than a new person coming in and going, well, why do you do it that way? Especially when they go, I don't understand what we're doing here. Why do you do it that way? We, in organizations, particularly in industrial ones, although to be fair, an academic one like where I am is no different, sometimes we process ourselves to death, and we don't really think enough about practice. And, arguably process and practice are two different things. And, we can write down the process and we can follow the steps, but the practice is what actually gets done. We've both been in enough industrial settings where, we have this standard operating procedure right here. Why didn't you look at it? Oh, no, we don't do it that way. We do it this way. Well, then what's the point of a standard operating procedure then? And so when I think about, again, going back to your question about leadership, is that we also are in a time now where our technology does enable us to have adaptable training, not just accessible and not just sort of up to date. If you're not up to date, that's the wrong word, but it's not static. It can be adaptable. But I think one of the things that a lot of companies or organizations in general haven't at times been willing to do in the past is invest the time in creating the content so that it does in fact align with processes. Moreover, they've not documented well and kept up to date very well the descriptions of their processes, let alone having captured the art of their practice. That's why in many cases folks have been worried, in the last 10, 20 years about the baby boom generation retiring, because one of the challenges is there was a lot of inherent knowledge in those people's heads that when they went out the door, organizations got lax, and they unfortunately didn't really do a good job of maintaining that internal knowledge, that internal information, that combination of practice and corporate culture and how the two feed off of each other. They didn't really sort of document and capture that very well. One of the, we talk a lot these days about the fourth industrial revolution, right? Or this idea of digital transformation. It's a safe bet that 10 years from now, it'll be something else, right? But the point is that, certain technologies that are available to us today can help in this regard. Yet again, it's a lot of people have said this, is that, don't get too enamored with the technology without making sure that your practice and your culture is coming along for the ride. Because if it's not, you can buy all the technology you want. It's not going to matter.
Yeah. And I want to circle back on a few of those items you just raised, because it's important for the audience to really, honestly write this down. I'm old fashioned. One, you talked about the inherent knowledge and how do we capture that? How do we translate that? How do we make it digestible? How do we reuse that? That's an issue organizations and leaders are facing. And then you talked about the adaptability or the fit for purpose, right? We have to have training that flows and it's a bit more cohesive. And I think to do that, and I'm not for sure you mentioned this word. If you did, I apologize. It's accountability, right? So we have to hold ourselves accountable to ensure we're assessing our training, assessing how we are managing that knowledge, how we're storing that, the actual change management of knowledge management, the change management of our training, change management of our systems. We've all been there. I'll use product lifecycle management, something you and I know it's near and dear to our heart. Typically training, and I think this applies across all functions, all competencies, typically training it's last on the project plan, or if it's not, it's typically your picks and clicks. This is your new system. This is how you log in. This is what you need to do to progress something from A to Z.
Or Joe, one of the first things to be eliminated when things are running over budget, or when economic times are not good, what's one of the first things to be eliminated? Training.
Absolutely. Training, and right after that, usability. And I say that.
Yeah.
I say that with a smile on my face, but unfortunately, it's true.
Yeah.
We sacrifice all the wants, and then we boil that down to the proverbial needs, and the users aren't getting their needs met, and it's just a dangerous cycle. And we talk about OCM, that compounds, right? That compounded interest of doing things incorrectly or not doing it at all, and it costs. And I really, really like the adaptability. I like the fit for purpose, that the ability to track that inherent knowledge. But at the end of the day, I'm a big believer in holding ourselves accountable as leaders. I know I've made mistakes, but then I've adjusted. But I hold myself accountable, and I hold my workforce accountable. We do it with our clients as well. One thing I'm really proud of on our OCM model is, when we assess an organization, that DNA assessment, we identify everything about that entity or that industry or that client. We identify all of the process, their as-is processes, their as-is systems, their as-is workforce structure, their as-is needs from a vertical or a diagonal slice across the workforce. And when an organization invests in doing that assessment, and you include training, now you at least have something to start from. And honestly, and it's disappointing to say, very few organizations are including training and knowledge management in those assessments for their to-be roadmap, right?
Right.
Everybody's got the financial sustainability, scalability, grow our footprint. We always want to make customers happy. Two of them, and we're going to talk about this one later on in the series. You don't see a lot of companies standing by quality anymore, and internally and or externally. It's a token statement at best. And then this knowledge management and true OCM. And to me, that's what we're talking about. It's from a leadership, before we move on to the next topic within this little subset, my opinion is it starts with accountability and then investment, and then identifying the right partners to work with from an unbiased perspective. That's another one that we haven't really touched on, is allowing an unbiased perspective to challenge that status quo within your company.
Well, and to, that the notion of bias, especially when people talk about technology and they talk about its transformational aspects on the workforce as well as on the workplace. I've seen a lot these last couple of years, prior to the pandemic, and then now as we're sort of coming out of the pandemic, so to speak, beginning to hear this and see this again, where people are looking, right, and they're comparing and they're benchmarking and they're doing those kinds of activities to look at, okay, what are the people who are in my market, in my community, whatever that might be, what are they doing? Now, I mean, that's probably been going on for as long as there have been, companies making stuff. They've compared themselves to the others, and there is a little bit that can be healthy about that. But one of the challenges that I see companies having is how it relates to technologies. In fact, I was just in another meeting earlier today, working with one of the standards committees, and we were talking about, for example, why do people always think that this concept of, say, model-based definition immediately means I have a CAD model? Well, for the viewers of this podcast, it's important to understand that the 3D digital model is how, for better or for worse, how many companies begin to create their design artifacts these days. And when you talk about the digital transformation of a manufacturing enterprise, one of the easier starting points is to begin to leverage that 3D model through an organization, using it for all of its communicative and precisional characteristics, right? I think I just made up a word there, precisional. But anyway, the point is that it's not to say that MBD is only CAD, but that's just where often the easiest jumping off point for people is. And so the reason I'm talking about this in the context of this podcast is that when we talk about organizational change management, I think from a leadership perspective, you need to pick up on, is there an easier and relatively speaking more digestible jumping off point for my employees, for my organization? You can do multi-divisional mergers and separations and spread stuff across different continents and so on and so forth, but that's rather complex. And I mean, that's not to say you shouldn't do it, but it's rather complex, right? But I think when we talk about culture and we talk about educational aspects of an organization, as well as the mechanics of change management, I do think just humans being what we are need a digestible chunk, if you will, to start off with. It's that proverbial proof of concept, right? That proverbial 0001 in the serialization process, right? Is we need that in order to be able to gain comfort with what's happening, to eliminate our biases with what's happening, or at least mitigate them, and but also to see that something can work, and then jump into some more of that complexity.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think this is actually a good transition to that next level, which I'm just set up as kind of the director level or manager level. And we'll talk about some of those precisional elements. I'm not for sure that's in Webster, but we'll give you credit for it.
It is now.
Try to sprinkle it in there for you. But as we move from that leadership, setting the stage, being the voice, and communicating that down through, the C-suite or the executive staff down to the director level. And that's right where we're at with what you're talking about. Now, how do we take this message of change and take these new methods that we're being tasked with deploying to the workforce and our people? How do we make it digestible? Nate, thanks for joining us today. It's just been honestly, I hope our podcast audience has enjoyed this as much as I have. And this is just part one of our Ecosystem of Tomorrow series. Part two, we're going to actually discuss operating models. This one's going to be an interesting one. I've challenged my team with trying to keep us into each one of these being one part, but I don't think that's going to be possible. But as long as you have the time, I'll continue talking to you. But again, thank you for joining me for the Ecosystem of Tomorrow, talking about OCM. And I look forward to our next session, which is operating models.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me. And I'm looking forward to the next one.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe and review the show. And for more information on IpX, visit ipxhq.com.